So a politician is walking down the streets of Sacramento. It's late at night, it's not a good area of town, and suddenly he sees a shadow slip out between two buildings, and to his horror, he feels the imprint of the muzzle of a gun in the small of his back. And a disembodied voice whispers in his ear, "Mister, give me your money." He raises himself up to his full height. He turns around to confront his attacker, and he says in a loud voice, "Don't you know who I am? I'm a senator." And the voice says, "In that case, Senator, give me my money." So I like to start speeches with politician jokes, and I've got about 1,000 of them. But the reason why I tell them, there's a method to my madness, which is that I don't consider a lot of us who serve in Sacramento, particularly the conservatives, I don't consider us politicians. And so I tell that to break the ice and to illustrate the fact that there's a difference between a public servant and a politician. And I don't think I'm a politician. I'm a video game developer, as you heard. Kind of interesting the way that happened. I was studying engineering at Caltech because when I went to school there, we weren't allowed to study computer science. It wasn't considered a real science. So I studied engineering, and I've been writing educational software on the Apple II computer, which shows my age, if you remember that. And I saw an ad on the bulletin board outside of our computer science department one day, and it was looking for an expert in a certain microprocessor. And I scratched my head and said, wow, I actually know how to write code for that microprocessor. So I answered the ad, and it turns out that it was a company in Japan that no one had ever heard of them before. They were very small, very distant, and they had a strange, outlandish name. But perhaps you've heard of them now. They called themselves Nintendo. And I started working with them, and I started writing some of the first video games for the Nintendo Entertainment System, which was the first video game machine that Nintendo manufactured here in North America. And so that led to a whole career for me writing video game software. I still do it. I have a studio in Big Bear Lake. I have 28 employees right now, and we do development on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch, all the console platforms. But we also do about half of our revenue these days on mobile, so we do apps for Apple and Android phones and tablets. So that's what I do. I never even considered a career in public service at all. But then about 15 years ago, I was a tenant at the Big Bear City Airport. And as you probably have followed, as a hobby, I fly light aircraft. In fact, my wife and I flew in here into Sonoma tonight to be with you. And so I've been a tenant at the airport for the whole 25 years we've lived in Big Bear. And what you need to know about our airport is it is a California special district. So if you want to be a board member, you must run in an election, just the same way as we elect city councilmen and mayors and assemblymen and all those other offices. So about 15 years ago, there was a lot of dysfunction on our board. There were big personalities calling each other names. They were in the paper every week. And a few of them came to me and said, Jay, you ought to run for a seat on the board of directors. And I said, fellas, I don't know anything about politics or elections or parliamentary procedure. And they said, well, that might be true, but you're a businessman, so you know budgets, you know management, you know employees. And you've also been a tenant here for 10 years, so you know airplanes and airports. And here was the kicker. They said, you can't possibly be worse than what we've got. So I said, okay, if the bar is really that low, maybe I'll try it. And so I ran for the seat, and I was elected, and much to my surprise, it really suited me. So I served 5 years there, served 3 terms as the president of the board, and when my term was up, we had an open seat on city council, so I ran for city council, was elected, served 4 years there, ran for mayor, was elected, served two terms as mayor, and then in 2014, this was an open seat, and so I ran for the 33rd Assembly District, and this is now my 3rd term in the Assembly. So I look back on that, and it seems to me to be a very unlikely path into politics. But I'll tell you this, in service in Sacramento, I really wish that there were more people that had a non-traditional background. We have far too many people in the state that run for elected office as a career. We have far too many people in Sacramento that are there because it's the best paycheck they've ever gotten in their life. And we serve best as an elected body when we have a large diversity of people from all different backgrounds and walks of life. And I wish we had more people from a wider, diverse range of backgrounds in Sacramento. So I am the chairman of the Assembly Republican Caucus, which means I'm the number 2 person in our power hierarchy. I also am the ranking Republican in budget in Sacramento. and vice chair of the Assembly Budget Committee. I also sit on a small group of people called the Budget Conference Committee that reconcile the Senate budget, the Assembly budget, and the governor's budget into one document every year. They lock us in a windowless hearing room for 3 weeks in May to do that. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I also sit on the committee for appropriations. So anything to do with dollars and cents in Sacramento, I'm deeply involved in. So I thought that I would take a few minutes and talk about the finances of the state tonight, because a lot of people really don't realize what goes on with the state, especially when it comes to money. And yet I think it's some of the most important decisions that we make in Sacramento. So the governor just rolled out his budget a month ago, and I always have to make the point that this is the governor's proposal. The governor does not write the budget in Sacramento. The legislature writes the budget, and the governor either signs it or vetoes it. But the legislature writes the budget. All he can do is suggest. So, as is tradition, he rolled out his suggested budget the first week of January. And it's kind of like a Dixonian novel in California right now. It's the best of times and the worst of times. It's the best of times because we have an unprecedented budget surplus. Over $20 billion of surplus with a B. That's the largest budget surplus in state history. Kind of the worst of times because we also have the largest spending in California state history. If you include general fund and special fund spending, over $300 billion of spending. So a staggering amount of money. So the governor, our new governor, Gavin Newsom, has to propose what he would do with his surplus. And he's done actually something that's pretty fiscally conservative. He was kind of channeling his inner Jerry Brown this year. And what he's proposing to do with that $20 billion is he's going to spend half of it and save half of it. So he puts about $10 billion into reserves and paying down of long-term state liabilities, and about $10 billion into new spending. But to his credit, only half of that $10 billion goes to ongoing state spending. So in other words, half of it goes to one-time projects that don't create ongoing budgetary pressure for the legislature. So it could have been a lot worse in what he proposed. I'm really glad that he is considering putting more money into reserves, because we have an unusual situation here in California. 50 years ago, we got state revenue from 3 different sources, and they were about equal. We got state revenue from income tax, state revenue from the state portion of sales tax, and then state revenue from various fees and tariffs. And it was about a third, a third, a third. This year, we get over 70% of our revenue from just one source, and that's income tax. And of that 70%, over half of it comes from less than 1% of the population in California, because the tax rates are so progressive. So if you think about that, that 1% that are paying over half the income tax, they are not paying it on salaries. They are paying it on 2 things. They're either business owners and they pay it on business profits, or they are investors and they pay it on capital gains. So here's the problem that presents. When we get into even a mild recession, instead of making money, businesses start to lose money. And instead of appreciating, investments start to depreciate. And because we are so over-reliant on that 1% for our income tax revenue, a third of our budget disappears like that overnight. And I'm not talking about the fact that maybe we get into a recession and it goes down and down and down. I'm talking about this decline in state revenue is a leading indicator of recession. So it drops precipitously. So we saw this back in 2007, 2008 when we were in the Great Recession, where the state had a lot of trouble meeting its bills and making its payments. And we are set ourselves up for that even to a greater extent today because of our over-reliance on income tax. So because of that, we need to be very careful about our state spending. No one can say when we might have another recession, but we can say with certainty we will have another recession because we know our economy is cyclic. So we need to have big state reserves. So last year was interesting. We created a couple of new reserve accounts. And if you'll bear with me a second, I'm going to tell you something that I hope really ticks you off, because it makes my blood boil, and not enough people in California are talking about what the legislature did last year. So the legislature last year made a bunch of new reserve accounts for all of the state social programs. So there's a new reserve account for Medi-Cal, there's a new reserve account for CalWORKS. Why did they do this? Well, we have 2 reserve accounts before that, other than those. We have the BSA, the Budget Savings Account, which is something that the voters established a few years ago, and it's got a maximum cap of 5% of state revenue. And then we have something called the SFEU. It's a Special Fund for Economic Uncertainty. That's the original budget savings account, and it's just a sweep account. So anything that's left over in the general fund at the end of one year gets swept into that the next year. It's like if you have money left in your checking account at the end of one month, you start the next month with that balance, right? That's the SFEU. Well, there is a provision in state law that says if the balance of the SFEU ever gets above 4% of state revenue, that triggers an automatic 0.25% reduction in the state sales tax. So, the legislature, rather than letting the SFEU get to above that level, created new reserve accounts and told the public of California that they were being really fiscally responsible. So put it a different way, the state of California is refusing to give the people of California a 0.25% break on their tax in a year when we have a $20 billion budget surplus. Isn't that crazy? That just makes my blood boil. So I always want to tell people about it because it kind of we keep trying to shed a light at what they're doing, and they don't want to talk about that at all. That's the last thing that they want the public to know about, and yet it's very important. And illustrating the same point is some of the things in the governor's budget that really make me mad. So they are proposing to impose a bunch of new taxes on Californians in this budget. First of all, there's a water tax that you've probably heard about because we beat it back last year, we beat it back the year before that. And this year, the governor's introduced it as part of the budget, and it will institute a new tax on drinking water. Like they'll be taxing air next, I guess, but drinking water that will be collected by your local water agencies on every single water bill that you pay, and a new tax on fertilizer and a host of other things. And this is to pay for clean and healthy drinking water in disadvantaged communities that don't currently have access to it. Now, here's the thing, though. We all believe in having clean drinking water for all Californians. That should be a priority of the state. But look, we have a $20 billion budget surplus. Why don't we use some of that $20 billion to solve this problem rather than taxing people more? There's another proposal in there to tax, there's an existing landline phone service tax that goes to pay for the 911 system. And they're proposing to extend that to cell phones, which currently don't pay it, and to expand it so that everyone pays more. And this would pay for a next generation digital 911 system, which everyone agrees that we need. But again, we have a $20 billion budget surplus. How on earth do we not have the money to pay for this without taxing Californians? So sorry to go up on my soapbox there, but it just really makes me mad, that stuff, because we have a problem with basic affordability in this state. And we just make it worse every time we pass a tax that Californians have to pay, especially when it's a tax on something like water or phone service. That's a regressive tax that's disproportionately paid by the people who can least afford it. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple other topics I think that you might find interesting tonight. First of all, I want to talk about redistricting, because that is coming right up. It's right around the corner. And I was tasked this year with heading up a committee in the Republican caucus to prepare for redistricting. And what I found out about it is that I didn't know beans about redistricting. It turns out to be really complex. So last cycle, in 2010, we transitioned to a citizen redistricting commission. It's supposed to be nonpartisan. Before that, the legislature drew the lines. Now this citizen, non-biased redistricting commission draws the lines. And I think that the Republican point of view at the time was, oh, it's going to be nonpartisan, so they must not be unbiased, and we'll just let them do their work. Well, that turned out to be a bad idea. So we're not going to let that happen again. The first thing that's going to happen is that on June 10th of this year, applications will open for members of the public that wish to be members of this redistricting commission. And there are 14 that will be ultimately chosen. You would think that this would be something that not very many people applied for, but last cycle they had 30,000 applicants. And ultimately 5,000 of them were deemed to be qualified. So that was the pool for 14 spots last year, last cycle was 5,000. And I'm sure it's going to be more this year. The requirements are actually kind of stringent. You cannot be a member of a partisan political organization. So if you're on the Central Committee, I'm sorry about your luck, I'm ineligible because I hold partisan office. You can't have even contributed to a partisan political campaign. So they're really looking for people that are Republicans, Democrats, and decline to state, but that are not deeply involved in the political process. So What we are going to be doing is reaching out, trying to build a statewide database of good conservative people that fit that eligibility criteria. So the way it happens is in August, they'll close the nominations. Then everyone will fill out a supplemental nomination packet in which they answer some essay questions about why they want to serve. The state auditor will then appoint 3 employees to go through this and narrow that field of however many qualified applications they get down to a field of about 120. And then it's going to be very much like picking a jury, because we all get peremptory challenges. The Assembly caucus gets 2, the Senate caucus gets 2, the congressional delegation gets 2, the CRP gets 2. And so we can challenge people that go on the commission. So if there's a Democrat that we think is kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing, we can knock them out of the field. So when everything is done with that, the auditor will pick 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and 2 independents. And they will conduct the first meeting of the redistricting commission, and they will select the remaining members from the remaining pool. So I thought that was a really interesting process. So we're going to be deeply involved in that this year. We're going to make sure we get some good conservatives on the commission. And then the real fun will begin, because when they draw these lines, we want to make sure that we're not disadvantaged. So we want to make sure that the people on the commission, particularly the conservatives, know about the ways that we can be drawn out of elections. And we want to make sure that they have all the information they need to draw districts that are fair to us and hopefully advantageous to us. So those districts will be drawn up probably by the end. We'll get the census data, which is what we need to start from. That will come in at the end of 2020. And then the commission will meet to draw those districts in 2021. And the district will be drawn and approved by the end of the year, by December. Which is kind of frightening if, as I do, you hold partisan political office, because it means that when we run for re-election, we won't know what the districts are until December of the year before. So you think about that, it'll be a very short campaign cycle. So this is a politically sophisticated audience. I thought you'd appreciate hearing about that because it was much more intricate than I ever thought. The last thing I want to talk about tonight is I have a lot of constituents that ask me questions about the election in November. And I get asked the same questions enough times that when I talk to conservative groups, I assume that you probably all have the same questions that they have. And so I thought I'd share the answers that I have with you. So one question that I get quite often is, wow, what about that blue wave in November? What about that, huh? We lost those assembly seats, we lost the Senate seats, we lost the congressional seats. That was just a big blue wave that happened, and that is hogwash. We actually got a really good look at the data for the first time about 2 weeks ago, when the 460s were due for all of the congressional, the Senate, and Senate campaigns for the fourth quarter of last year. So they were due, and we finally got to look at them to figure out what happened, because we can see when we look at them, we see where the money came from, we see how it was spent, and what it was spent on. And so we can figure out, okay, what were they doing? Were they doing TV? Were they doing radio? Were they doing online? Were they walking? What were they doing with the money? And this is what we found. It's not a blue wave that overcame us in November. It was a green wave. It was all about the money. And to someone like me, actually, that's very reassuring, because I understand that. I've run campaigns for a long time now, my own and other people's, and I understand about campaign finance. And it makes a lot more sense to me that when we are outspent on average of 3-to-1, which is statewide what it was, statewide we were outspent an average of 3-to-1 in all of our contested races. And some of them we were outspent 4-to-1. Mimi Walters, who's a good fundraiser, Mimi Walters was outspent 4-to-1 if you include independent expenditures in her congressional race. So it's really hard to overcome that. And if you look at where the data of where that money came from, very non-traditional sources. It came from lots of small donor sources, and not from here in California, but from across the country. So typically, the Democrats raise a lot of money here in California, and they ship it elsewhere. But what we saw last year was a reversal of that, where they raised money from elsewhere and shipped it into California, because this is where the congressional seats were that they needed to win to flip the House. Okay, so that's what happened. And they did it through platforms like Act Blue. And I would encourage you, if you're really interested, if you're interested in this like I am, go download Act Blue. It'll be an application for your Android or your Apple phone, and play with it a little bit. And for God's sake, don't give them money. That's not what I'm saying. But it is an incredibly sophisticated tool. Their onboarding, as we say in the industry, which means the barrier between when you download it and when you're up there using it, is incredibly low. They've done a great job at engineering that platform to be as frictionless as possible. And once they get their hooks into you, you get emails all the time. I tried it. I just played around with it for a day. And I guarantee you, right now, I've got one email at least in my inbox. And I checked it before dinner. I've got one new fundraising email from some Democrat somewhere in the country looking for money. And they do it in a very smart way. They don't say, hey, give money to the Democrat Party, we're great. They say, hey, we've got this race in Louisiana. We're really close. We really need your help. We're trying to send out this one other piece of mail. If you could chip in just $5 tonight, we could get that done. That's what they do. They have specific little goals. And they make it really easy for people. All you do, you don't have to go in, enter credit card stuff. That's done. All you got to do is say yes. And it's done. I mean, they've got your credit card, it gets charged. All that stuff is taken care of. So that created this wave of money coming into California. We were outspent statewide by over $100 million. I want to give you a little illustration of how bad the problem was from my own district. So my congressman is Paul Cook. My whole assembly district is within the 8th Congressional District. So Paul Cook was one of the very few congressmen this year that was a Republican on Republican race. That shows you how conservative that congressional district is. He did have a Democratic challenger that didn't make it out of the primary. It was a candidate no one had ever heard of before named Marge Doyle. She is a healthcare board member in Yucca Valley. No statewide name ID. In a conservative district, she had no chance of winning. She didn't even make it out of the primary. Okay, if I painted the picture? She raised over $400,000 through Act Blue. In a seat they had no chance of winning. So that's what we're up against. So, I mean, what can we do about that? Well, I mean, first of all, we were behind in ramping up our small donor giving. The Republican Party, we've always had great relationships with the corporations. We have great relationships with big donors because they tend to be more conservative. And so we've over-relied on those people to fill our coffers, and that's got to change. We did have, I get people come up, well, what are you bozos? By the way, that's exactly what they say. They say the word bozo. What are you bozos doing about that? How did you let the Democrats build Act Blue and you didn't build anything? We did build stuff. Unfortunately, we built it about 8 times because we're Republicans and we're all entrepreneurs. And so we had a bunch of different people saying, oh, I'm the official conservative platform, and nothing really caught on. We didn't have something that was blessed by all of the different agencies. So we are building one. You'll hear about an announcement about it in the next couple of months. It's already been blessed by the NRCC and the House and Senate delegations in Washington, and they're going to have a big rollout. So we will not have that disadvantage going into the next cycle. So another question that people ask me all the time is, well, what about that voter fraud? Boy, we had all these races statewide that on election night, the Republican was ahead. And then in the next couple of weeks, every day we looked at the tally and we lost 100 votes here, 100 votes there. And by the time 2 weeks later rolled around, the Democrat won. That's just fraudulent. And I'll tell you this. We have looked very carefully to see if we can find voter fraud, because if it is there, we want to make sure we stamp it out. But here's what we found. Very little evidence of outright fraud, and a lot of evidence of the Democrats taking advantage of the rules that they themselves rigged for the elections. So they're the ones that enabled voter-voter, where people get automatically registered at the DMV to swell the voter rolls up. They're the ones that have made it very difficult to prove who's voting because they won't allow voter ID at the polls. They're the ones that have extended the voting deadline so that if you're an absentee voter, your ballot only has to be postmarked by election day, doesn't have to be received by election day. They're the ones that know about all the inconsistencies with the provisional ballots and refuse to do anything about it. Okay, but all of that is legal. So that is what we're dealing with, and that's going to be the norm moving forward. If you want a really interesting read, our Republican candidate for Secretary of State, Mark Moyser, who comes from this neck of the woods, I'm sure you met him, if you go on his Facebook page, he's actually an election attorney, and he spent the month after Election Day as an employee of the CRP going to different registrars of voters doing our ballot integrity project. And so he wrote up the results of what he saw there. And there are a lot of things that are not going to make you happy, but what he says, very little evidence of outright voter fraud. So I do not believe that there are a bunch of people that aren't legally registered to vote that are voting. that shouldn't be registered to vote that are registered. I do believe that the Democrats have rigged the rules in their favor and are exploiting them. And then one last question that I get all the time is about what is this ballot harvesting stuff? You know, and how did you bozos, there's that word again, how did you bozos miss that? And how did you not know that ballot harvesting was going to be a thing, and why aren't we doing it? So, I mean, first of all, yes, we were well aware that ballot harvesting was on the horizon. In fact, many of us, myself included, were in the legislature when the rules legalizing ballot harvesting were passed, and we all voted against it because we knew that it would disadvantage Republicans and conservatives. So we certainly knew it was coming. And we did our own ballot harvesting. In fact, just about any Republican campaign at scale did ballot harvesting. But here's what we're up against. First of all, Republicans, just by constitutional nature, are less likely to give up their ballot to someone that asks for it than a Democrat is. Right? We're just more skeptical. When someone says, hey, give me your ballot, I promise I'll turn it in for you. And so we do that a lot less often than a Democrat would. So that's part of our problem. But here's the other problem. Part of the problem is that we are not thinking about ballot harvesting the right way. Most people think about ballot harvesting and they think that someone just shows up on a doorstep and asks for a ballot. That is not what the Democrats are doing. They are establishing a relationship with voters in an area. And when someone asks them for their ballot, it's not the first time or the second time or the fourth time that they've seen that person. Here's what they'll do. They'll send someone into an area and they'll knock on the door and they'll say, hey, I'm from the, fill in the blank organization, Planned Parenthood or, NAACP or ACLU or whatever it is. And I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm your block captain. And just it would be great to get to know you. Just wanted to let you know who I was. That's it. And the second time they knock on, they say, hey, you know what? We're having a rally this weekend. Free hot dogs. Come on down. You can meet your neighbors. The third time they'll say, hey, have you met your local candidates? Because we're having a candidate forum next week, and we'd love to have you come out and meet them. The fourth time they say, hey, I noticed that you're an absentee voter. Have you got your ballot? Because if you haven't, there have been people that have reported that they've been lost in the mail. We can help you get it. The fifth time they say, look, it's really important that you vote this year. See that you haven't turned in your ballot yet. Really want you to consider, filling it out. And then finally, they show up the week before the election and they say, if you filled out your ballot, I can take it to the polling place for you and save you a stamp. You see the difference? It is not a ballot harvest as much as it is a relationship that they're building. And they are way better at it than we are. And we need to get better at that if we're going to start winning races in California again. We are hampered by the fact that we don't have the depth of nonprofit and community organizations that they do to reach people. We've got some organizations that are very conservative, like the NRA, but we don't have very many of them. Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, they don't have wide memberships. It's not like the ACLU. So, we need to fix that. We need to find ways of building those relationships. The other problem that we have with that, it comes back to money, because it's very difficult to run an operation of that scale with volunteers. In fact, it's almost impossible. And the Democrats don't do it. Those are all paid political operatives that are going door to door to door. They're incredibly organized. They're provided with technological tools that make their job easier, that put all the data together for them, and it's funded by multi-million-dollar donations from their large donors and their big agencies. So that is what we need to start doing. When someone says ballot harvesting to you, that's what I want you to think about. And I wanted to conclude with just some observations. People ask me, well, how can you be in the legislature as a Republican in Sacramento? Doesn't that get old? How can you get up there and get your teeth kicked in every single day? And I'll tell you this, this is the most difficult job I've ever had in my life. It takes me away from my business, it takes me away from my home, it takes me away from my family. I couldn't go there every week if I was not a California optimist. And I am. I do believe the political pendulum swings back and forth. It doesn't swing ever as fast as we would like it to, but I do believe it's swinging in California. And as proof, I want to offer you this. Think about the fact that we have the highest taxes of any state in the country. We have the highest income tax. We have the highest total sales tax. You might think that Prop 13 saves us on property tax, but it really doesn't, because our property values are so much higher than normal that 1% of those equals 2 or 3% in other places. So our property taxes are even above average. So people know this in California, but the thing that people think to themselves is, well, we're paying for better government. We care more about our neighbors. Okay, but this is what Californians are starting to realize. And this is new. right? This has happened slowly, but these statistics are new. We now have the highest poverty of any state in the country, right here in California, the highest poverty. We should have the lowest poverty if we have the highest taxes, right? We should have, the highest taxes equals though the best, all the things that government can buy, we should have the best of. We should have the lowest poverty, we should have the best schools, we should have the best roads. How are we doing on that? Well, our schools are in the bottom 10% by any objective measure, 46 or 47, pick a measure, test scores, graduation rates, anything you like. And by the way, it's not the teacher's fault, it's the state's fault, it's the system's fault, and the administration's fault. How are we doing on roads? Well, we're 49th out of 50th in terms of our pavement infrastructure, and we're getting worse. So the average Californian is fed up, and every time they get a power bill and they see that we pay twice as much for residential electricity as Nevada does, we pay 3 times as much for industrial electricity as Arizona does. Every time they get a water bill and they see all the tacked on charges, every time they file a tax return, they're getting more and more upset. And at the same time, the Democrats are moving off their base. They're getting pulled to the left by the progressive end of their party, saying some outlandish stuff. Have you read the Green New Deal? Have you read that frequently asked questions document? Oh my goodness, it's a gift to us. You couldn't make up stuff that would tick off the average American more than that. Okay, so the combination of those two things, I am 100% convinced, is going to keep that pendulum swinging back in our direction. And although it might take some time, I am 100% sure that our effort will be rewarded and that we're going to see a conservative resurgence in this state. So I want to thank you very much for being conservative in the state of California. That's a great question. So if you couldn't hear, the question was about the Trump tax cuts and the fact that California is disadvantaged by that. And first of all, I think that the Democrats are madly trying to re-message what the Trump tax cuts did. Because we did an analysis in my district when those cuts were passed last year, and 90% of my constituents pay less tax under the new system as they did under the old. And the Democrats don't want to talk about that. They want to characterize it as, oh no, only the rich benefit. No, 90% of my constituents pay less. So now we're reading, just in the last week, you're reading about people are upset because their refunds are lower, right? Well, yeah, because the new Trump administration is doing a better job of computing what they owe because the tax system is simpler, so that the government's not stealing as much of their money, right? So there's less need to give it back at the end. So, I mean, that's, unfortunately, that's kind of a subtle distinction, and as the campaigner in me will tell you, while you're explaining, you're losing, right? So, I mean, that's a difficult message for us to fight. But to answer your question, it's a point that we enjoy making in the legislature. And in fact, last year I was co-author of something called PEPPER. Because what people like to complain about when the Trump tax cuts is SALT, the state and local tax deduction. And that's what the Trump tax cuts limited at $10,000 as a way of saying to the high tax states, hey, look, don't expect the federal government to subsidize your high tax structure. So we authored and introduced PEPPER last year, and I forget what it stood for. But we made up some stupid acronym for it. But what it did, so instead of the federal government making state and local taxes deductible on your federal taxes, we proposed making federal taxes deductible on your state taxes. Okay, and the point was, it was ridiculous. I mean, we never expected to get it passed. But the point was how hypocritical it is for us to pretend that this is a benefit that anyone is entitled to. This idea that you should be able to everyone says, oh, it's double taxation. Well, sure, it's double taxation that you can't deduct your federal taxes on your state tax return. So we introduced that to illustrate the point. But I think that messaging on why the state and local tax deduction really makes no sense from a fiscal tax policy is something that we need to do more of. Yes, ma'am.
As you know, the Judicial Watch helped the Election Integrity Project do something with those absolute amazing dead people that were voting in Los Angeles. Do you think that is going to help throughout the whole state? Other cities are going to be aware that the Judicial Watch is watching them as well?
That's a great question. The Judicial Watch and the Election Integrity Projects, great organizations. I'm a trained election integrity project poll watcher because I was interested. I went through the project, so was my wife, and both of our sons were poll watchers this last election. It's a really interesting experience for them. Yes, to answer your question, it makes a big difference what they are doing because it sheds a light on how destructive some of the processes that are legal here in the state of California are to voter integrity. And it's still amazing to me, this focus on voter ID being discriminatory. I don't understand that at all, that I have to show an ID to use a credit card at the supermarket but not to vote because they're afraid that that's going to deter someone from voting. I mean, it's just, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but you know, it's projects like the Voter Integrity Project that shed a light on that. So very helpful. Yes, sir.
Yeah, one of the people I dislike the most is the Attorney General, who's, I think he's filed something like 48 lawsuits against the federal government since Trump has taken office. Does he have any accountability in terms of his staff spending money and time about this lawsuit?
That's a great question. So, Javier Becerra, you know, is there any accountability there? And the answer is no. They're proud of what they've done, and in their defense, that's what the state of Texas did under Obama, right? Their attorney general filed just as many lawsuits against the Obama administration, I would say in a lot more meritorious ways. But that's what states of the other party do, unfortunately. You know, however, first of all, let me say that the state of California and Javier Becerra are paying the price right now because if you are a state and you thumb your nose at the federal government too often, pretty soon the federal government's not going to like you very much. And guess what happens when you have $3 billion that's been appropriated for the high-speed rail authority, and the federal government has the opportunity to take it away because you didn't meet your bond obligations? Guess what? The federal government's going to say, hey, give us that $3 billion back, which is what the federal government is doing. And guess what? It's going to continue happening. I actually have an even more compelling reason for disliking the Attorney General. And that was the gas tax repeal, Prop 6 of last year. And if you know what happened to us with that, that was a great issue. We worked really hard to get it on the ballot. We worked really hard across the state to educate people. And because they put that deceitful, misleading ballot summary and title on it, that was blatantly unfair. And I don't know if you heard the whole story on that. We sued them. The moment the Attorney General put that, if you're not familiar, it was repealing the gas tax. So you might think that an appropriate title and summary on the ballot would be, this measure repeals the recently enacted gas tax increase, right? That's fair. Instead it said, this measure eliminates needed transportation funding. Okay, and it was blatantly misleading. We sued them because it was misleading. And here's what the court said, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, of course. Here's what the court said. They said, well, actually, the Attorney General is under no constitutional obligation to be accurate. Go read the opinion. It'll blow your mind. They are empowered to set a ballot title and summary, and they do not have to make sure it's unbiased. So, that's what we're up against, and that's why I have a real healthy dislike for our Attorney General. Yes, ma'am.
Well, tagging on that, doesn't Kevin Kiley have something that he's proposed to take that away from the Attorney General to write these summaries and make it the legislative analyst office?
I think I've heard something about that, and we have a title for things like that. We call them statement bills. And to be fair, I have a couple of my own. They're bills that I know are not going to get out of their first committee, but I introduce it because I think that we need to have a statewide discussion about it, and the way that we have discussions in the legislature is through legislation. Right? So we introduce them knowing that they're not going anywhere. I believe that Kevin has a bill like that. No, it's not going to get out of its first committee. Good on him for trying. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the upcoming census. And I know there's a debate about whether we should identify or not identify citizens or not. What's your opinion on that?
Well, so the question, if you didn't hear, is what's my opinion about what the Trump administration has proposed, which is to ask a question on the census about whether or not people are legal citizens. And that has been going back and forth through the courts. It's like a ping pong ball. And it's going to wind up inevitably at the Supreme Court, probably sometime in the next few months, and we'll see what the Supreme Court says about that. I actually expect that the Supreme Court will uphold the Trump's administration's authority to ask that question, because just like when we talk about the Attorney General, I don't think that there's a lot of constitutional framework around what questions they have to ask in a census, right? So I think that legally he'll have the ability to do that. I think it's very interesting that we have a constitutional provision that says that non-citizens gets counted when we do a census. So in other words, when you're drawing a congressional district, why should it matter how many non-citizens live in the district? Are we going to, where do you draw the line there? I mean, what about tourists? What about someone that just happens to be there on a 6-month visa? Do they count too as being a resident of that congressional district? At some point, you've got to draw the line and say, okay, here's what we're counting and here's what we're not counting. But when our Constitution was written, this wasn't a big thing. We didn't have a lot of temporary, transient people that were in the country, and so they really didn't worry about this problem. It's the same thing with birthright citizenship, where the framers of the Constitution never envisioned that someone would be able to fly here on a 747, have a baby here just to make sure that they had U.S. citizenship. Wasn't even conceivable. So, unfortunately, our Constitution in some of those ways hasn't kept up with modern life, and I think that that's one of the ways in which it has not. Yes, sir. And then I'll come to the front. Back first and then the front.
There's a lot of young people in this country that are being lied to, and they're believing the lies. I just heard Kamala Harris say that Trump's going to resurrect the KKK. These people believe that they don't understand the history of the Republicans. And I don't see any kind of marketing campaign that's going on. You're preaching to the choir here. But the young people at universities and stuff are being lied to, and they're believing these lies and drinking the Kool-Aid, and they're going to vote in a Democrat because they believe the Republicans were the ones for slavery, were the ones that voted against women's rights to vote. They voted against the 14th Amendment, all those kind of things. They also believe that the Jim Crow laws came from the likes of Trump. Why isn't the Republican Party doing something about it?
So it's a great question, and let me validate your question before I give you some hope at the end. Okay, so first of all, I think the problem is even bigger than you have characterized it, because we're up against a mainstream media that hates anything that's conservative. Right, and so the answer, the simple answer to your question, why aren't we doing anything about it, is because it's very hard for us to get our message out with what we call earned media, which is media that we don't have to pay for, when none of our message is getting picked up by the mainstream media. So I mean, it's not a level playing field. It's even worse than you think it is, because in addition to the problem that young people get bombarded with messages from one side but not the other, is also the fact that our entire educational system is set up right now, particularly in California, to indoctrinate these kids with the liberal progressive mode of thought. And it's a mode that they're already kind of attuned to, because young people are usually a little bit more liberal than we are when we get older and more jaded, right? Okay, so I mean that's what we're up against. It's an uphill battle. But I mean I want to give you some hope. First of all, the millennials and the younger generations are the first generation of kids in history that have been bombarded since birth with marketing. It's never happened before, but since birth, every video game they play, every thing that they see on their phones, everything that banner ad they see on Facebook, these kids have been bombarded with marketing messages. And I'll tell you this, because I speak to a lot of young people, it has made them very jaded and very cautious. And they know to a greater extent than any of our generations knew at their age to be wary of someone that's trying to sell them something. And that is absolutely true, and we see it in our marketing data again and again and again. I'm particularly optimistic, though, about Generation Z. That's the generation that's graduating high school right now. If you look at the data, the demographic data, they are very different from Generation Y, the generation that came before them. I'm Generation X, the millennials were Y, the new young people are Z. Generation Y, the millennials, was a very liberal generation. It was kind of a resurgence of the hippie movement in the late 60s and early 70s, kind of do it if it feels good, almost libertarian that way. Generation Z, they are conservative. They are religious. We're seeing a resurgence of interest in religion amongst the youngest generation of Americans. And so I have a lot, and I think it's funny because if you see Evan Lowe, who you probably know, Assemblyman Lowe has a bill this year to lower the voting age to 17. Okay, and I don't think it's going to get a lot of traction, but I was thinking about it when I read it, like, be careful what you wish for. Because that generation is going to rock their world. They really are. It's a combination of being cautious and jaded about the marketing message and espousing the conservative principles that the generation before them has rejected. So I am a long-term optimist about that. The question is about educational funding and how can we spend so much on education and get so little back in return, and in particularly when we approve bonds at the local and the state level, what happens to that money? So let me answer kind of like a 30,000-foot view of the way that education finance works. So we've got Prop 98, which is what you referred to, that sets a minimum amount of the general fund revenue that has to be spent on education, right? So it was supposed to be a minimum when the voters approved it. By the way, that was one of the most cynical voter initiatives in California state history because it was completely funded by the teachers union, right? And therefore, the legislature has been equally cynical in enforcing it. And instead of being a floor, the entire legislature views it as the ceiling. Okay, that's what you wanted, that's what you forced on us, that's what you get. We calculate that number and we give it to you. And every other penny that you get for education has strings attached. And we're going to force you to spend it the way that we want you to spend it. So it's kind of a tug of war with educational funding. But having said that, you have to realize that education is the single largest expense category in state spending. I mean, a lot of people think it's health and human services, it's CalWORKs or Medi-Cal. No, it's if you combine K-12 education, the community colleges, the state colleges, and the UC together, over half of state spending goes towards those things. So the problem is that we're fighting this losing battle. We're still, even if you add all of that up, we're still, I think, in 41st in per student spending across the country, and that's not adjusted for inflation. The fact that it's more expensive for teachers to live here, for schools to operate here. So, we've got a real problem there. To answer your question about bond funding, usually bonds have some specific purpose, and the reason for that can be found in the legalese of Prop 13 that says that what the voter threshold is to approve a bond. And the reason I know a lot about this is that this is one of my main areas of legislation, and I won't go into detail. It's the thing I'm most proud of all my service in the legislature is a series of bills that I wrote, making it so that you couldn't hijack Prop 13 to pass a bond on a majority vote instead of a 2/3 vote. So as long as you say it's a special purpose, it's not going to the general fund, it's going for school facility construction. Okay, well now you can pass it with a majority vote instead of a 2/3 vote. And so people do pass them. And to answer your question, no, it's not part of the Prop 98 cap. That's outside of the Prop 98 cap. But the reason why Prop 98 exists is emblematic of why we have a problem with educational funding in this state. So I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I've really enjoyed getting to know you. I will leave this out of business cards. If I can ever be of service to you, please let me know. But I want to thank you very much, not just for coming out and supporting your Central Committee tonight, not just for celebrating Lincoln and Reagan as great presidents, but most importantly for being conservatives in the state of California.